say mahalo to all of our sponsors, the Surfrider Kauai Foundation, Sierra Club of Hawaii, Malama Moloa'a, and the Kilauea Neighborhood Association. Those have been our sponsors for this inaugural event, and I would like to thank everyone here for attending, and of course, all those who sponsored in time, monetary, and even sharing your mana'o as well. So I would like to, because I don't want to take any more time, and I know we are starting a little bit later, but I would like to first call up our first speaker, Richard Stevens. Mr. Richard Stevens, here we go. Let's give a hand for Mr. Richard Stevens. He will be expounding on the topic of why are ancient trails important. So the platform is now yours. Thank you.
I've been working with trails all my life, actually. I was fascinated with tracking trails as a kid. In the military service, I hunted for the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Vietnam. When I came back, I was hired to be the first trail researcher on the Big Island. Debbie Chang, who you'll hear from later, hired me for that job. And so I had a dream job for 5 years of hiking the backcountry of the Big Island and finding trails. In that time, I found 300 to 400 trails. Believe me, they're everywhere out there. If you know what to look for, it's fascinating to see just what an incredibly rich trail world is still left out there. And now here we are working together to save that world and to use it in ways that express the love that I mentioned before. This slideshow is called Hawaii's Ancient Trails and Their Messages for Today. This is an important thing to think about. We're looking back into ancient times, but we're getting messages for what it is we can do today to tune into these trails, to learn from them, to connect with them, and then to see that they go on. So we're into preservation and restoration. There are 4 categories that you can think about as you're listening to this about how messages come to us from ancient trails. And so I want you to think about these. We'll actually make that 6 categories. The first 2, beauty and mystery. Beauty, ancient trails are beautiful. Back in 1992, Debbie Chang and the Na'alahele staff put together a calendar called Historic Hawaiian Trails. The photographs in that calendar were spectacular to show just how beautiful trails are. This is something that you folks here on Kauai might think about doing too. You've got your beautiful trails here. A calendar would be an excellent way of getting more and more people to see the beauty of these old trails. Both in their unworked on state, and then after you clean the trails and they leap up from the land to show you just what they have, you will be struck by how beautiful they are. Then there's the category of mystery. Plenty of messages of mystery that come from a trail. You're standing on an ancient trail, the thoughts that come to you have to be, who has walked this trail before me? Where does it start? Where does it go? How is it connected to the whole great network of trails on every island? When you think about that network, you can think about a spider web laid down over the land, and all the strands of the spider web reflect the Maukamakai trails, the Alaloa, the shortcut trails, the many kinds of trails that were out there. And then you think of that spider web just pulsating with life. It's a fascinating thing to get into the whole trail world. 2 more categories, magic and mystery, or magic and mana. The magic part of the trails is that when you have your feet on the trail, you become part of a great procession that stretches back into time. back to the very first person that ever walked that trail. And then you can think that that trail does not exist in and of itself, but is connected to all the rest. So you can imagine that when you're on any ancient trail, you are connected to all of the trails of that island. And that takes you back to the very first foot that was ever placed on the shores of this island. That's a powerful thing to be tuning into and coming right up through the soles of your feet. There's mana. Mana, spiritual force. The Japanese have kami, the Chinese have their chi, the Indians their prana. This is energy, and trails pulsate with that energy. They radiate it. And again, when you're out there amid the ancient stones, the trail bed, the vegetation along the trail, all of that is communicating with you. And the more open you are to it, the more you will receive. The last two, importance and connections. For importance, I want to turn to a beloved member of the Big Island community and the island-wide community, Herb Kane, the artist, historian. He left behind a wonderful legacy of paintings that allow us to look into ancient times. Herb Kane said, "A culture without its artifacts is nothing." That's a very scary thought. A culture without its artifacts is nothing. Trails are precious artifacts. I'll refer again to Debbie Chang, first head of the Na'alahele program. In her book on 2 historic trails in Kona, she writes, trails are part of a living heritage, a unique culture, living treasures. Notice the use of the word living here. Living treasures that show the survivability and ingenuity of Hawaiians in the natural world. This cannot be underestimated, the importance of trails in ancient times, and now we're seeing their increasing importance here in these times. In ancient times, it was the way the culture moved. The economy went on trails up to the uplands, down to the shore. You can imagine that every day, and many nights too, especially full moon nights, there was activity on those trails. And that's the way much of life was carried out. Those trails were the arteries of life in ancient times. And those arteries stretch right up to us here and now. And that brings us to connections. The English poet and novelist of the early part of the 20th century, D.H. Lawrence, expresses it really well when he says that I am part of the earth my feet know perfectly well. That kind of connection that we make with the land when we're walking on an ancient trail is a connection that goes back to the very first person that ever walked that trail, all those that came after, and all those that will come after us. And now here we are, connected by this common love and working together. This is a really important thing that's happening here, believe me. This is going to have huge implications all over the Hawaiian Islands, what we are all doing here today. So, beauty and mystery, magic and mana, importance and connections. So we're going to take a trip now in a few pictures through the world of ancient trails. These are, as you would imagine, mostly Big Island trails, but they look very much alike on all islands. You can factor them right into your own experience here. So you will see a number of photographs of trails. You will also see a number of paintings done by my Nai brother, Wailehua Gray. He passed away a few years ago, but he was a colleague and contemporary of Herb Kane. They sometimes exhibited together. His paintings help to tell the story where there are no photographs to do that. And so you will see a combination of art and photographs to tell this story of the messages that come to us from these wonderful artifacts. So here we go. Let's see if this works. I'm going to signal hope over here. By the way, I thought it was really interesting also that the lady who's done much to organize this is also named Hope. I really think that is the theme. Hope that's powered by love and powered by unity. And we thank you and all the people that brought this together. I'll be taking back to the Big Island much of the energy and inspiration that I've received from associating with you today and our events yesterday also. What you're looking at up there right now is a picture that was taken from one of the observatories on Mauna Kea. And it's reminding us that every story is a universe story. If you're going to tell me the story of your life, I want to hear it right from the beginning. And that's the beginning of everything. And that means that we are connected in some very special and powerful ways. So the story of Hawaiian Trails really begins with the beginning of everything. And when you think about the energy that is out there, you want to, again, open your consciousness to bringing it down here and immersing yourself in that energy. To think that we are all part of that is both a very humbling and a very empowering thought. So open yourself to it, and it will help to empower us all as we carry out this mission that I think we've all been called to in our various ways. So we begin with the universe. And this is Wailehua's painting called Kumu, or Source. This is his depiction of, again, this blast of energy that started things off. The way he did this painting was he painted it all black to start off. That was Po, the cosmic darkness that we read about in the Kumulipo. So out of that darkness then comes the world of color and form and energy and eventually us. We're lucky that we still have around the islands places where you can see this energy happening as the islands rose from the sea. So that reminds us of the primal nature of all of this. No humans on the scene yet, but the mountains begin rising from the sea and rising all the way up into the winds where they act like a net, start to bring the moisture down. And from there, life begins to catch hold here at one of the Anchialine ponds along the west side of Hawaii, where you can see how this process might have happened. Fresh water, seeds blowing in the wind, floating on the waves, falling from the wings of birds, and beginning to clothe the land. It's really nature that determines where the trails will go. Because of the kind of vegetative patterns, climate, that will make resources available to the trail makers who come later. This is a painting of Wailehua's called When the Leaves Floated and the Trees Danced with Fire. He had a whole series of paintings that he called his Pele series, where he was tuning into these energies and trying to depict them in a way that began to bring his people, he was half Hawaiian, into the scene. It's pretty hard to see in that painting, but way over on the right, on the sea, there is the site of that first canoe approaching the shores of the islands. And so from over the deep blue, they came, and that's what this wonderful organism here reminds us, that the people who came here came a far journey over some of the deepest parts of the ocean in the world to these shores. So the trail extends back into these times. Ralph Waldo Emerson has a wonderful quote that is, beneath each deep, another deep opens. We can see that in our own lives. We can see it in the story of trails, that it doesn't just begin with the first trail, but it's connected to all that came before, and now we are giving direction to what comes after. Just imagine now that first foot coming onto a trackless beach. All the islands would have had this moment when someone stepped out of the canoe and put his or her foot on the sand. I'm guessing it was a him. At any rate, all the trails of the island are connected to that moment. I believe firmly that the first artifact that was made by the first people to come here was a trail. It was a trail to fresh water sources, a trail to food sources. Trails are precious artifacts. They're among the oldest things made by the first people here. And believe me, any trail that you stand on today is connected to that magical moment when that first foot hit the sands of these islands. This is the way Wailihua tried to convey what he felt would have been the feeling of those first people coming, a feeling of relief after a long and uncertain journey, a feeling of joy and elation, and also of wonderment of what is this place? Do the gods live here? Will there be enemies to greet us? But definitely a feeling, again, we should try to get into this ourselves to keep that sense of wonder and awe that was surely part of the first landings here. This is a petroglyph that I found while doing this trail job, and I still, once you get bit by the trail bug, and a number of you probably know this already, you'll be looking for trails everywhere. And they are everywhere too. So you find other wondrous things in your search for trails. And the feeling that I get from this petroglyph, the paddle raised, and it looks like exaltation overhead, had to be part of the feeling of those first people, those first trail makers here. Another of his Pele paintings to try to convey what it must have been like to people coming from a non-active volcano world to one in which the volcanoes were still very active. Also mountains so high that, excuse me, they had snow on top. And so again, that feeling of wonder and excitement and passion that would have been part of those first days here for the first people. The trails eventually spread from that first imprint on the sand to the highest mountains. We've just, in May, had an important case that we'll be hearing more about later, the Haleakala Trail case on Maui, in which I was honored to be a part of the team. And so you can think that the spread of trails then over time goes everywhere. It reaches every part of the islands, even those considered most inaccessible. And so these are reminders of that. There were undoubtedly trails here already before people came. That would be another thing to cause wonderment, awe, and questioning when those first people landed here, who made these trails, and then they probably saw a giant flightless bird coming. Those birds would have had trails to their favorite feeding grounds too, and their favorite water sources. Very large birds. And so the trails that we think about have other users. Just like on the mainland, the great trails of our history, the Oregon Trail, Santa Fe Trail, Wilderness Trail, those were all indigenous peoples' trails before they became important in our history. And before that, they were game trails, animal trails. And so it reminds us of our connections with the natural world. and studying the wisdom of indigenous people constantly reminds us of our connections with that natural world and the lessons that we can take from it and need today. Here you see an example of a shoreline trail. This could have been like the one, that's a bird, by the way. It's called the moanalo, or the disappeared fowl. They would have made trails like this that then would have been very useful for the first people, and probably those first trails were shoreline trails and along the flowing streams. The use of coral along the trail still is a useful thing to guide you if you're out there walking in the moonlight, the moon shining on ahu made of coral is a magical sight. And so thinking again of the kind of work that went into their first trails here, when we can see those today, again, it's an energizing event. Of the bringing of plants from other parts of Polynesia and seeing them become established then is also a part of the story of trails. And going to start blending in the theme of reforestation here. This is a lot of what we're doing on the Big Island now, is combining trees and trails. It's a wonderful combination. Those of you in nonprofit groups, I'll tell you that when we started doing this on the Big Island with our own nonprofit, we were told there's a ton of money out there for reforestation. And so you can combine causes like trails and trees in a way that can really help to finance your efforts. Right now also, the US Department of Agriculture pays over $11 per Hawaiian tree that you plant. So if you have any desire to reforest, you have some excellent sources of help to allow you to do that. You can plant a lot of trees in an acre of land, and at $11 per tree, that can help finance the kind of things that nonprofits are usually having difficulty with, the green energy that's necessary to make these projects happen. So those of you who are interested, check into your NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service. It's part of the Department of Agriculture. And you will find that not only the planting of trees, but the preparing of land for planting trees, they will subsidize. This turns to another part of the world to give us an idea of what it looked like here along the Lo'i. These are rice paddies, of course, and this is the island of Bali in the year 1967 when I went there on R&R from Vietnam. And I was really struck by the beauty that the Balinese put into their agricultural efforts along streams. And I realized that very probably this is a lot of what it looked like here in Hawaii, although you just substitute kalo for the rice there, and you can picture how beautiful it was. Notice too the balance between the nature that has not been disturbed and the agricultural lands. It's a wonderful combination of using what was there with what agriculturalists add. This is from the island of Sri Lanka, and again, it's looking to other places to get an idea of what it looked like here. Notice you can see trails running right up to the door of the house there that's along the beach. Some of the vegetation very similar to what we have here. And again, you can get ideas about what it looked like and how the trails played an important part in all of these places by some that remain today to tell us what it looked like here. Over it all is the spiritual aspect. And Wailehua loved the io, the Hawaiian hawk, that was very prevalent around where he lived near Waipio Valley. And so this painting is called Aumakua. And it reminds us that in everything the Hawaiians did was the spiritual element. And that's a great thing for us to build into our work too, to remember that there are different levels to life, and the more you can access the higher and the deeper levels, the more energy you will bring forth. And so this kind of reminder of what was here can become part of what is also. Malcolm Mackay trails were really probably the most important part of the economic lifeline that linked the resources of the uplands with the resources of the shore and offshore. And this is what a trail looks like when it's been cleaned. Cleaning the trail is getting the invasive vegetation out of the bed, getting the curbstones back in place again. And when you do this, when you clean trails, the trails literally come to life again. And it's a magnificent feeling to be part of this. Kids love this, older people love this. It's a work of restoration. And I want to suggest to you that your presence here is an example of what we are living through now, which is the age of restoration. You may feel frustrated with some of the battles that you've fought and the direction things have gone, but we are in a new century now. The 20th century got the unfortunately appropriate name of the age of anxiety. Now we're in a new century. We're in the 21st century. And the more you use this term, the age of restoration, the more you think that way, the more it will happen. And I can tell you as a teacher at the UH branch in West Hawaii that the young people are coming into our classes already primed for this. The kind of education that we heard about from our opening Oli is what young people are getting all the way from elementary now up to college. The age of restoration is here. And the more we can get behind that, the more we can join forces, as we are today, the more we will make it happen. So, age of restoration, use that term and spread it around. It's happening all over the world. Wailehua's painting here reminds us again of the spiritual level that existed, especially among the Ali'i, as he's picturing here, and I'ivi, which he has combined with the look of a cape to remind us again of the structure of society here and of that spiritual nature which connects to the natural world. The Malcolm Mackay trails again. When I mentioned back at the beginning about the beauty of trails, you really can see this after you clean a trail about how beautiful it is and how it illustrates again these kind of connections that are part of one of the principal themes of trails. This is a trail that branches. It comes down from the uplands. You notice then it forks. It's going off in two different directions there. You can imagine people coming down from their work this is in the Kohala Field system up in the northern part of the Big Island. I always imagine friends coming along to this point of the trail. Some perhaps are going off on the right branch there, others on the left, and they're calling to each other as they begin to part, maybe making plans to meet down on the shore someplace. It's also a lot like life. You come to these points in life where you have to make these decisions. What do I do here? Which way am I going to go? And in the case of applying trails to this moment, often we get guidance along trails in the form of ahu, and those are the kind of things that we need to build into our life and our work now, is seeking that guidance when we come to these points and then following the trail of life on. Special stones along the trail. This is called a pohaku okiaina, or land dividing stone, usually large triangular shaped stones that you find sometimes on the borders of Ahupua'a or the ili, the smaller divisions within the Ahupua'a. But again, reminders of the life that was lived before, perhaps now hidden in vegetation, but still with their stories, their messages. And again, when cleaned, they are striking in their reminders of the past. Aumakua stones, stones that are set up along the trail. Perhaps the people in a particular area did that to honor their family Aumakua. But again, part of the mystery of trails. That's part of the fun of them, actually, is not always knowing exactly how to interpret what's there, but feeling the depth. And I think if you can do that, it isn't necessary to know exactly what was meant by this, but just to feel the power of it is important. This is an example of how these stones often are beside the trail. The trail is running to the left of that stone that we saw in the previous picture. So trails as important lifelines of spirituality as well as the economy and cultural development. This is a fishing shrine. This is taken from some of Wailehua and my hikes together along the coastline of Kohala. And many of these still remain also down at the end of the trail, where you can imagine the fishermen on their way to fish and making offerings. The tea leaf, whenever it appears in Wailehua's paintings, are to remind us of the spirituality of the ancient Hawaiians. This is a trail that's very much associated with Kamehameha I. This goes down to the shoreline at Hapu'u Bay in North Kohala. At the top of this trail is the remains of the heiau where Kamehameha kept the war god, Ku Ka'ilimoku. And so when we walk on this trail today, when we go down to this a favorite fishing spot, again, you can imagine putting your feet where the great man himself walked. That's a powerful thing to think about. We have a wonderful opportunity here to tune into directly through the soles of our feet the great heroes of Hawaiian history. This is Wailehua's rendering of Ku Ka'ilimoku, and again, reminders that whether in peace or war, spirituality was the overriding concern of Hawaiians. And the way that it's a reminder to us also that whatever our spirituality, you can deepen it when you're out there on the trails. This is a painting called King Kamehameha Contemplates the Moon at Kapanaya. Kapanaya is a favorite surfing spot. Most of the kids of Kohala learn to surf there. And it's a place where Kamehameha and his friends made a trail to get their surfboards down to the beach more easily. And he's pictured Kamehameha gazing at the moon. And with the next slide, so we'll surmise what he might have been contemplating. He might have been contemplating the arrival of people from the other world. This was of great advantage to him in many ways. Petroglyph carving of a whaling ship. And so we've entered a new phase in Hawaiian history now. The trails go on, but now there's a new element in the land, people from the outside world. And this is one of the things that they were after. This is a sandalwood tree. This is a miracle survivor in a land where cattle have destroyed almost all the native vegetation, and you just have mostly kiawe trees growing. But still, now and then, you find these reminders of the past. This is part of the whole reforestation effort that we're doing on the Big Island now. We're planting a lot of iliahi, a lot of sandalwood trees, and they are gorgeous trees. You can sometimes smell in the wind the fragrance of the sandalwood blossom, and that can help you to find lone trees like this. This is a painting called Kauai High, and this illustrates the effects of the sandalwood trade. Kauai High, if you're familiar with it, is in Kohala, the northern part of the island. There's a harbor there. And it's one of the most land-battered places in the islands. The deforestation, which came about largely as a result of the sandalwood trade, there's plenty of sandalwood trade growing on the steep slopes leading down to Kauai High, led to a gradual drying out of the land. There's a wonderful Hawaiian saying that goes, rain always follows the forest. And if the forest is retreating, rain is diminishing. And what you see in this painting is those ships waiting offshore. You see people carrying the sandalwood logs down to be loaded on the ships. And you see the land drying out in stages. And this is what the land looks like in a lot of those places. This is a Maukamakai trail you're looking at right here. But it's in a place where first deforestation, then overgrazing, then the trail filling up with wind-blown and waterborne silt to the point where it almost is not recognizable at all. But if you know what to look for, as I said, there are still hundreds of trails out there, and they're waiting to be discovered and restored. This is a heiau called the Navigation Heiau on the North Kohala coast. This is where the Polynesian Voyaging Society still goes to have awa ceremonies before their journeys. There was a training school here, a university for navigators. Some of our kupuna in Kohala tell about their family history and being part of navigation and training for. Again, it's connected by trails. Maukamakai trails come to it. The shoreline trail runs past it. Soon the national trail, the Alakahakai, will make it, or at least along its base, the trail will run also. So the treasures that are out there along the trail continue to tell us about the wonders of life in those times. This painting is called Kipuka. Kipuka is an island of life in the lava sea. It's where recent flows of lava will come down and flow around elevations, leaving behind a kind of island of native vegetation. The trail runs around the base of this kipuka. That's the koa trees on the kipuka itself. And the whole concept of the kipuka as an island of life is something that we can incorporate into our work today with reforestation combining with trail restoration to form new kipuka. You can make kipuka in your backyard with plantings of Hawaiian plants. So it's a wonderful concept. The more kipuka that we can make throughout the islands, the more we will restore much of what has been lost. How do you find trails? If you have a helicopter, that's a good thing. We have Dennis Hart here, who has been on the front lines of the trail wars in Kohala, cleaning trails in the face of opposition from landowners, but yet believing in the mission. And this picture shows just how many trails there are out there on the land. So, right now I'm working on a project in the old Kona field system that's 9 acres of unbulldozed land, and the trails are everywhere on this. So when you're in places that have been part of these great agricultural systems, you can look for a labyrinth of trails to discover. This is about phase one of trail searching. Out there in the brambles and thorns, and peering into the cover of forbidding vegetation on the land. And yet that love that I mentioned back at the first is what propels people like Dennis, and you'll hear from him later, and his crew. But it starts with some reconnaissance work that takes hardy souls to get into and find all those trail remnants. Here's again a picture of that, the second stage of finding a little bit clearer evidence. You see this beautiful trail that's being found here. And then the next stage is rounding up your friends and getting them out there into the brambles also. And again, we have people doing this on the Big Island, and the leader of them is here today, and we're glad to honor him for what he's done. But it's getting people together just like you are brought together here now. And it's one of the great joys of life, I think, is to be out there working on trails and uncovering their wonders. And after some work, you can see this as the result of your labors, getting that trail back into the kind of shape that it would have been in its heyday. And it's just a matter really of this process of cleaning the trail, bringing it to life again. And again, you can see the beauty. These are trails that have been widened to accommodate carts in the early period of Western contact. And so you start out with a trail that is usually about double arm's width length. And once horses and wagons are on the scene, then they're widened. So you usually can tell by the width of the trail something about its age and use. And again, those spiritual reminders along the trail. Kane stones, often upright stones that represent the god Kane. Agricultural areas will have those usually to tune into the higher powers. Vegetation can often be your clue in where trails are. You notice here a fountain grass has grown in the bed of the trail, making it very clear where the trail runs. Right now we have an exciting project going on which I hope is going to be duplicated on your island, on all the islands. It's cooperation between a developer and in this case the university to restore an ancient trail that will be a public access trail. This is a really momentous event, I think, in the history of trail restoration, when you start to get that cooperation between the landowner and those of us who are lovers of trails. I think whenever you can do this, and as people become more enlightened and as people get more into the age of restoration, you will find more cooperation to do this, and maybe even some assistance from the government. What you're really uncovering out there is, as I said, just beautiful. There are different, all kinds of different trails, each with their own special nature. And again, it takes you right back to the first people who made that trail, to the people who ordered the trail made in a particular place, and then chose some of these beautiful surfaces to run the trail over. It's almost like a picture like this speaks for itself in terms of the beauty, the mystery, the magic, the mana, the importance, the connections. It's got it all. And again, while this is a recent addition to the trail, it attempts to duplicate what was, and especially is making that effort to remind us that the making of trails, the traveling on trails, the purposes for which people were on the trails all had this spiritual element. And again, the more we can tune into that, both to keep us humble and to empower us, the greater will be our successes. These are some of my students, again, on one of these trails that the trail warriors of Kona have brought to life again. And so these are ideal teaching devices. I take my students out several times each semester to work on trails and to plant trees. Again, that magical combination, trees and trails, native reforestation and ancient trail restoration. Students love doing this. And also, as I said, they are primed for it already by the kind of education they're getting in the lower grades now. It's a very encouraging thing to see how motivated they are and how dedicated to the culture. This is the Veterans Cemetery in West Hawaii. This is a major success story that our students have carried out over the last 10 years now, of bringing the dryland forest back. The lowland dry forest is the most endangered ecosystem in Hawaii and around the world. And so working in the drylands is more challenging, of course, than planting trees in the wetter areas. But as you can see here, it can happen. It's choosing the right species, it's getting the right people together, it's restoring the trails that make it possible to get into these areas, and the joy then as it all starts to happen, as you really see the forest coming back. The dryland forest actually had more species than the upland wet forest, which is not the case generally as you look around the world. But here in Hawaii, the dryland forest was rich with species. We plant in the uplands also, again, guided by the trails, conducted to our planting places by the trails, so that wonderful combination is at work again. This is in the Koloko area above Kailua in Kona. And you can see the golden bark on the koa trees there. Those are young koa trees. Koa trees, if they're planted in a place that they like, can grow 10 feet a year. Those trees that you're looking at there are about 3 years old. And so both in the uplands and in the lowlands, the drier areas, the combination of trees and trails works in a magical way. And this is our last picture here. This is a place that, this is up in Kohala Mountain. It's near the summit of Kohala Mountain in the north of the Big Island. It's a place, my son was an avid pig hunter when he was in high school, and he and his friends called this the Green Temple. And I just love that name for this place because it is so evocative of, again, the spiritual world that we've referred to several times now, the green, which indicates a movement that's going on all over the world now too. That's another reason you can be hopeful about the age of restoration. And the wonder that trails can lead you to. Mahalo.
Thank you again for your presentation. Before we go on to